Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dudney Phillip from Jobs for the Future, and I'd like to welcome you to Qualitative Methods and Implementation Analysis. Thank you all for joining us. I'd like to take this time to run through some of the tech overview. For those of you who are logging in online, we'd like to ask you to please mute your phone lines to help limit background noise, and to also turn off the video function on your screen as well during the course of this webinar. This will help us to limit the background noise for our presenters. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available to everyone who attended and for folks who didn't have the chance to attend. If you need any WebEx technical support, whether you're running into audio issues or something is wrong with the function as we're going through the presentation, please dial 1-866-229-3239. WebEx will be able to assist you directly. During the course of today's webinar, we will be using the chat box function, which you can find at the bottom right of your screen. Once again, we'd like to remind everyone to please mute your phones to help to limit the background noise during the course of the webinar. If you have any questions for the presenters during the course of the webinar, please use your chat box in the bottom right of your screen. I'd like to now turn it over to Randy Wilson, who will provide the introduction into the webinar content.
Thank you, Dudney. I hope that there isn't distracting background noise from any of you, so I just want to reemphasize Dudney's request that please mute your phones. We want to be sure everyone can hear the webinar nice and clearly. Okay, good afternoon, or good morning. Thank you for joining our webinar on qualitative analysis and implementation techniques. For today's webinar, we're going to do something a little different. Most of our webinars and roundtables for TACT has focused on quantitative techniques for analyzing program impacts and the challenges of using them. And while it's critical to know if the TACT programs have made a difference in participants' outcomes, we also need to know how they made a difference, especially because a central goal of TACT is to change systems and build capacity of community colleges and their workforce and industry partners. To tell the story, we need powerful frameworks and techniques for studying implementation and for collecting the data on programs in their context. So we've invited representatives of two TACT evaluations, one from a consortium and one from a single college, and they're going to share with you an overview of their research questions, their techniques. They're going to report on their findings and particularly how those qualitative findings complement the outcomes analysis, and then describe any challenges they may have experienced in studying implementation using qualitative techniques. Our first presenter is Marcela Montes from Workforce Strategies Initiative at the Aspen Institute's Economic Opportunities Program. She and her colleague, Renita Jane, are evaluating the Gulf Coast Information Technology Consortium in Mississippi and Louisiana. Our second presenter, Jane Jensen, is based at the University of Kentucky College of Education Evaluation Center. Her team is evaluating several projects, one at Elizabethtown Community and Technical College's Online to Work program, and another project based in Southwest Virginia. Let's hear Marcela and then Jane's stories about telling the story at each project, and then we'll turn to you, the audience, with any questions or points you want to discuss with our evaluator guests. Marcela?
Thank you so much, Randy. Yes, I'm unmuted. I just wanted to make sure that folks could hear me.
Sounds good.
Okay, so can you hear me? Yes, okay. So thanks again, Randy and then Dudney for organizing today's webinar, and to JFF in general for hosting us today. As Randy mentioned, my name is Marcela Montes, and I'm a senior research associate at the Aspen Institute. And for those of you not familiar with the Institute, we're a policy studies organization based in Washington, D.C. And as Randy mentioned, I work for a unit called the Workforce Strategies Initiative. And our mission is to elevate promising practices and policies that improve access to quality training and employment for low-income adults. Evaluation is actually one of the mediums that we use to carry out this work. And currently, we're managing the evaluation of the Retraining the Gulf Coast Workforce through IT Career Pathways Consortium. We are leading the implementation and qualitative side of the evaluation, and we have partners at the Ray Marshall Center for the Study of Human Resources out of the University of Texas at Austin, who are leading the impact component. And my colleague Ashwita from the Ray Marshall Center is actually at this webinar today as well. So before I go into the details about our evaluation work, let me tell you a little bit about the consortium that we're working with and the project that they're doing. So this is a Round 2 TACT grant, and it's a consortium of 9 colleges across Mississippi and Louisiana. And they came together to respond to a growing demand for IT workers in the region. The consortium is led by Bossier Parish Community College, which is located in the Shreveport region of Louisiana. And I should also note that this consortium is looking to connect students to careers in IT by applying the IBEST approach. And for those of you who are not as familiar with the IBEST approach, it's a strategy that was developed in Washington State, and it's the approach of integrating adult basic education instruction with technical training in order to accelerate academic achievement and credential attainment. Usually one of the ways in which instruction is integrated and mostly used in this consortium is through team teaching, and that is where a technical instructor will teach a course with an ABE instructor. So this is actually a strategy that has been scaled up in various states through JFF's initiative Accelerating Opportunity, and I should note that this consortium has worked in tandem with that initiative. And of course, it's also important to note that the consortium chose to implement this strategy to address the need throughout the 2 states to improve basic skills and increase post-secondary attainment numbers. So as you can see, I've listed below 3 of the main deliverables that this consortium is responsible for, including this idea of integrating IBEST into building IT career pathways. And I should note that as a part of that, the consortium developed a core foundational IT curriculum that will be implemented in all of the 9 campuses. And the idea was that by going through this foundational curriculum, students could earn some basic IT industry-recognized credentials, but also be prepared to advance in one of the 3 IT subsectors that I listed there: cyber networking, health information technology, and industrial technology. So let me actually move on to the goals of our evaluation. And for some reason, I can't seem to advance. There we go. So the goals of our evaluation are to be able to document and generate evidence on the process of implemented integrated college and career pathway designs in IT. So for us, it would be the use of IBEST in these pathways, and then, of course, to be able to determine if these strategies have labor and educational outcomes for the students who went through these programs. And, of course, these goals are aligned with the goals of all TACT evaluations in general, which Randy mentioned at the beginning of this webinar. As a side note, the Ray Marshall Center is actually going to be conducting a quasi-experimental study, and as of now, it's intending to use a difference-in-difference approach to estimate the impact of the program on student labor and educational outcomes. So as you can see on this next slide, we have laid out our evaluation questions, which, again, we made sure to align with the goals that I described in the previous slide. And specifically, the implementation questions have been refined after conversations with both consortium leadership of Bossier Parish and grant leads at the consortium member colleges. And as you can see on the slide, we have 2 arrows connecting the 2 sets of questions to illustrate that complementary role of our evaluation of the impact and implementation studies. And I don't think that this will shock anybody on the line, but for us, the implementation study is really key in relation to what we want to answer through the impact study. without really understanding the context in which the program has been implemented, or knowing exactly how the program has been implemented, or what challenges it has faced, or how those challenges have been overcome, it's really difficult to interpret outcomes or impact, and in a way, ultimately, really hard to assess what specific elements made the program an effective intervention or not. So in that way, the goal with our implementation study is really to understand the context in which this program has operated. And we really want to document how the program has developed or how it has changed. And here you can see the methods that we have been using throughout our study. We're doing site visits once a year. We are conducting college surveys to all of the 9 colleges during year 2 and year 4. We've done periodic check-in calls with both consortium management and college, and we're also keep constantly reviewing key grant products and documents. So to transition a little bit more into sort of our lessons and challenges and what we have learned throughout, here I'm listing 3 of the top lessons we have learned as we have done this work during the last couple of years. So for us, context really matters, especially when you're looking at these multi-site initiatives. We have 9 colleges across 2 different states. Another thing that we really have kind of had to come to grips with as we've gone through this evaluation is that it's okay to rethink and adapt your plan as long as it fits with the resources allocated to your evaluation, of course, and the project's evolution and needs. And finally, just to stress that in the implementation side of things, documentation is really vital, is really what will explain why something happened the way it did and will really allow you to interpret those impact results. And I would like to give you a couple of more details when it comes to these lessons. So with context, what has really, again, like I said, made this evaluation particularly complex for us is that we're dealing with institutions across 2 different states, and policies can vary across the different states. The context is different. Even regional economies are a little bit different. And to give you an example, for example, the community college boards in both of these states actually function very differently. LCTCS, which is a community college board in Louisiana, is actually a management entity, which means that they can actually dictate policies across the Louisiana states. In Mississippi, the community college board is just a coordinating board, which means that they provide strategic guidance, and the colleges are pretty much autonomous when making decisions on an institutional level. And this has been something that we really have had to kind of take into consideration when working with the different colleges across the states, not only understanding how they carry out policies institutionally, but it has also affected how we're able to collect data. Another thing that, we're dealing with is that these are all, 9 different institutions that are part of this consortium. And, mind you, this is not rocket science, but they're all dealing with different environmental contexts. And to give you an example, 2 of the Louisiana colleges that are involved in this consortium were actually going through a merger when the grant was awarded in 2012. So that means that the grant was written before the merger, and when it came to starting implementation, these colleges were going through major institutional changes, which included staffing changes. There was even the elimination of programs, and in one of those schools, the program that they had planned to implement this grant in actually got eliminated, so they had to rethink everything and start kind of from scratch. So again, naturally, things have been affected by context when it comes to this grant, and we really have had to be very careful when stating our findings and when triangulating information, and to really just be keenly aware of the fact that we're dealing with 2 states and 9 different institutions. Our other lesson has to do with adapting our evaluation plan, and it's related to context, and it's really that sort of important to be kind of flexible when it comes to your plan. So to give you an example, we started this project thinking that 2 rounds of site visits, one at the end of year 1 and another at the end of year 3, would be sufficient to meet the needs of our evaluation. We have actually changed that, and at this point, we have gone out to the colleges at least once a year. Not all of them every time, but we have managed to go to all 9 at least once at this juncture, and our plan will be able to go to at least 5 of them twice during the grant period. So to give you more details, when we did our first round of site visits in the fall of 2013, and this would have been at the end of year 1, we realized that the colleges had barely started implementing the program. And this was because the first year was really spent planning and figuring out contracting issues. So the information that we gathered at that point was really fairly limited. We didn't really know what was going on with the program. And we thought, okay, maybe that's okay. We'll have the check-in calls, we'll have our survey that will allow us to systematically collect information on how the program has unfolded, and that will complement whatever we, didn't get through the site visits. Well, then we got the survey results, and that was helpful, but it also made us realize that there seemed to be some variance on how the colleges were implementing that IBEST approach that I mentioned earlier, and also the foundational core curriculum that I mentioned earlier. So even though we had just planned on site visits twice during the whole grant period, we have actually added a couple of rounds that will allow us to go to at least 5 of the colleges twice during the grant period, and this has been really useful because it really has helped us triangulate some of what we found out through the survey and also better understand why we're seeing some of this variance in implementation. So finally, with the third lesson that I mentioned, this role of documentation, as I alluded to earlier when we were talking about the complementary roles of the implementation and impact study, our role as implementation evaluators is really to document, note changes, and continue to document some more. And sometimes when you're in the weeds, it's hard to know how the two sides of the evaluation come together. And at this juncture, I can think of one example where our role has been pretty useful, I think pretty useful to our impact partners. And I have talked a lot about context and how that's important. And as it turns out, 2 of the 9 colleges in the consortium implemented the program as non-credit. And that was fine, because in their perspective and in their context, implementing the program as non-credit was the way in which they could execute it quickly and reach the students that they wanted to reach. The problem for us ended up being that in Mississippi, where these 2 colleges are located, there were certain data variables that would be needed by the impact side of the study that non-credit programs just didn't collect in this state. So at this point, to be honest with you, we're still trying to figure out how this will affect the impact study. But the point that I want to make is that at least through the implementation study, we have information on why these colleges chose this approach. And if we ultimately can't do much on the impact side with these colleges, we can at least document what they did and why they did it the way that they did. Finally, on this topic of the relevance of documentation, I want to say one more thing, which is actually the idea that sometimes it's actually hard to articulate the role or the purpose of the implementation study or this idea of documentation to those who are running the program that you're evaluating. And people tend to hear evaluation and they think, Judgment Day has come or something like that. And I just want to emphasize that we as a team have really strived to communicate that we're learning partners and that we just want to make sure that we can provide our clients with the most accurate information on how implementation has unfolded, and our hope is that ultimately they can use that information to improve and inform their programming, and also that information can be accessed by others wanting to implement similar programs. And with that, I'm going to stop and look forward to any questions that you might have, and here are our contacts if you want to reach out to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcella. That was great. So let's transition now to Jane Jensen of University of Kentucky College of Education Evaluation Center. Jane?
Hi. Great. Can you hear me? We good?
Sure. Loud and clear.
Okay. Excellent. Yeah, this, again, thanks to everyone for putting this together. We're really flattered to be able to join you. And having listened to Marcella's comments, I think this will, some of what I have to say will repeat some of these key lessons, which is really good. So we have we are the evaluators on 2 TACT grants, a round 2 and a round 3 grant. Yeah, we can stay there. And both of them are single institutions, both in the state of Kentucky, so they're under the same Kentucky Community College and Community and Technical College system. The Round 2 grant, Online to Work, was originally actually a consortium grant of I think 5 or 6 colleges, and they were only awarded a smaller grant for a single institution. So in some ways, one of the issues that we had there was to find out how they had regrouped from the larger application to the smaller project. The Round 3 grant was a more traditional grant development. So, and I'll talk a little bit about how that happened. We use in our implementation analysis a 4-stage design that I'll explain in more detail in a minute, that walks us chronologically through each project. And then in both of the projects, we are also, and for our impact evaluation, using propensity score matching, one with concurrent cohort, we hope, and the other with a historical cohort, which is going to be more likely. I will say just a little bit about the 2 grants. The Online to Work is a competency-based education program using on-demand online education in a business administration associate's degree. And the other is at Gateway Community and Technical College in Northern Kentucky. And that is an on-campus program in advanced manufacturing that features a variety of enhancements, including advanced welding technologies, some changes in their approach to coaching students and advising, and then also using some blended course delivery with some online modules. So they're 2 very different projects, but we are approaching them with similar designs. Next slide, please. Thanks. The 4-stage model that we use is one that we adapted from the National Implementation Research Network, and I've given the reference there. We found this really useful, especially as I mentioned, because the Online to Work grant had gone through such a substantive change right from the get-go. So the first stage of the implementation research is actually the exploration stage. So for us as third-party evaluators, we're coming in and actually going back in time and working with the grantees to try to understand how they chose the interventions that they wanted to use and why. It also helps us to identify all the stakeholders who were involved in developing the project initially, and to find additional documentation sources that may or may not have been included in the grant or in the materials that they've been sharing with us now. With the grant, the Online to Work grant, that meant going back to the people who had written the original consortium grant, who were not the same people who were actually executing the grant. So that historical exploration stage was really useful, especially on that one. The installation stage is more practically what most of us think of as implementation research, in looking at all the activities that occurred, not only in installing the components necessary to implement the chosen intervention, but also the organizational changes that may have occurred or not occurred in order for the intervention to be executed. And careful analysis at this stage also helped us define the process and communication patterns within the grant, as well as starting to build a list of stakeholders, individual actors, and important partners that we then use as sources of data as we move forward for interviews. I would give as an example at this stage, one of the Online to Work grant was one of a variety of grants at their college that were serving a similar population. So when they were doing their installation, they were running into some internal politics that they had to sort through. So that's the kind of thing that we could pick up in the installation stage. The initial implementation we found this to be very important because both of the grants were building off of existing kinds of curriculum. And so trying to identify where the pilot stopped and full implementation started was really important. So the first student served may or may not have been receiving the complete intervention as proposed, and parts of the project were sometimes still under development. So we were able to bracket that initial implementation and use that to conduct some formative assessment of the first tries with the first cohorts of students. And this was especially useful because neither of our two grantees had a specific pilot study or a pilot cohort. So in effect, we created that for them, which really alleviated some anxiety on the part of the grantees so that they didn't feel like they felt like they were just getting started and didn't wish to be judged on their initial failures. One of the project coordinators told me at one point, she said, I said, well, don't worry, because these students are not going to be in the impact analysis because they started before you were completely in place. And she said, oh, thank goodness, I was worried because we knew that they didn't get the full coaching that we've been training for. And I said, no, that's the whole point of initial implementation is just a chance for us to gather that information. And then finally, full implementation is what we would expect when the moment in which the project is fully delivering everything that it was designed. It's still a little bit murky because sometimes there'll be a component of the project that hasn't been finished yet, but it doesn't affect the students because it's something that happens to them in subsequent semesters. And this also helps us by defining full implementation. It helps us make a time mark where we know from this point forward these students will be in the impact evaluation, and prior to that it was we consider initial implementation. Next slide, please. So throughout our analysis, we used the questions highlighted by the Department of Labor and their guidelines for the evaluation. Two questions that were which we really highlighted in our two projects because they were seemed to be most critical were the in general, in what ways does the implementation present challenges to the institution, and to be able to monitor how the project was unfolding, but also in what ways local employers and workforce development practitioners understood the project activities. That was, I think, an understated aspect of both of our grantees' applications. So it was important for us to kind of catch that. But in addition to and then of course there were the other, for anyone here who's gone through the whole detailed evaluation plan, you know that long list of questions that guide our evaluation. But we also had some questions that emerged from our interactions with the grantee. Next slide, please. Thanks. So for us, as I mentioned before, at the Online to Work project, they had a little bit of a political situation of overlapping with other grants that had to be sorted through. So internal relationships were an issue and it may have influenced the implementation of the project activities. In another case, they were told that they couldn't recruit in a specific area because it would conflict with the recruiting activities of another college, those kinds of things. In addition to internal institutional policies and relationships, we also had, it was clear that we needed to pay attention to external relationships. The relationship, for example, between the grantees and the Trade Adjustment Act office in the state, being allowed to attend the rapid response meeting, things like that. And then finally, the other key example on this one is that the competency-based education doesn't follow a traditional semester pattern. So federal financial aid policies became a real issue for whether or not they could enroll students in their intervention. And that's an ongoing problem for them. It's outside of their control. But the changes in federal financial aid policy were something that we had to keep an eye on. Next slide, please. So I'm assuming that most of you are familiar with the basics of qualitative research. So I thought I'd go over some of the processes that we used and how some of the issues that we ran into. Like I said, by going back to that exploration stage, one of our primary goals when we first worked with the grantees, and we are only an hour and a half away from each of our each of our evaluation sites. So for us, it's very easy for us to kind of run down the highway and have a meeting, or to do it by phone. I know we are very lucky to have that. So one of our first goals was to define all of the possible sources of information that would be best for understanding how the project was unfolding. Documentation, the document analysis, we would look at the grant itself, the appended reports, any other documents that were mentioned. Again, we would look at context. We would look for state documents on the history of like in the case of the online program, the history of that online program. The grantee helped us identify documents, but we would also follow the trail wherever it led us, which meant at some points we were actually more knowledgeable about the overall history and context of their projects than the project coordinators were, which led to some interesting conversations. Then we used that document analysis in our interviewing process. At one of the sites, they were fantastic about documenting every single meeting. And at the other site, it was much more casual. So field work, attending meetings on the phone or in person, chatting with the staff, those kinds of things were more important, more and less important, depending on what kind of documentation we were getting from the grantees. We also used ethnographic interviewing. We would develop a purposeful sample, which is starting with the project staff and expanding that with stakeholders and partners that had been identified through the earlier stages of evaluation. Our interview guides.
Hey, Jane, you're all set? Did we lose you?
Well, we've temporarily lost our speaker, and we'll try to get her back on momentarily. Sorry about that. Please stand by.
I'm still here.
Jane, are you on?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you not hear me?
Yeah, we lost your line for a minute.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
I was talking about interviewing. Should I back up a bit, or?
Yes, please do.
Okay. So in our interviewing, we would, is this a good place to start?
Yes.
Okay. In terms of who we interview, it's a purposeful sample starting with the staff of the project and then expanding out from that to all of the different partners and stakeholders that seem to have a perspective on the project. Deciding who to talk to was really important because we would try to get information and different perspectives on the project to help us build the story. So not just the project staff, but also people who are observing it from outside the project. Finally, professional naivete is a concept that's used a lot in ethnographic work. And it's the idea of having coming in with expertise and background knowledge, but then bracketing that knowledge and assuming a position of naivete so that you're open to learning without preconceived notions of what we might find. And that's something that that's a stance that we try to take in all of our interactions. We can go to the next slide, please. Okay. Like Marcella was saying, rapport was really important, and we also similarly focused on collaborative learning with the two projects. We tried to focus as much as possible on partnership rather than judgment. I agree. Most of the time when we would the first meetings were always a little awkward because they would be often members of the staff would be thinking we're here to be judged, and we would enter every meeting with the clear story that although we were hired to evaluate the project as outsiders, we were not there to judge any individual. We also regularly reminded the people we spoke with that our goal was to help the project learn and that we would all need to work together to have that learning atmosphere. And generally that was well received, although not always. So we sometimes had to stay alert to different body language cues, and sometimes ways that people were responding in email to kind of stay alert to when the project stakeholders might be cautious of us. The one thing that we found in this rapport building process was how important it could be to help the grantees see how their learning was important, and to help build their confidence in the collaborative expertise that we were building through the evaluation, reminding them that we cared about processes, not just outcomes, and that we hoped that they would see how important their knowledge was to the overall success of the project, and that we needed to learn about best practice and organizational change and institutional capacity. And I feel like that's one of the things that we've been very successful in. In some ways, they send us too much information sometimes about cool things that they've learned about something that they were trying to do. And it's really opened a pipeline of information sharing, which has been very useful to us. Another way that we that we work with rapport is through the qualitative concept of member checking. We work with the participants we talk to them about help us tell the story, to help us tell your story. And then we've regularly shared our interpretations of what we were learning. So when we were doing that exploration stage, we would share with them the history of the project to date as we knew it, and ask for their feedback and more information if they saw anything where we missed something or had something wrong. And so doing this early and often made the development and final editing of the reports easier, and we hope more accurate and useful. That said, although we do collaborate with them on developing the information, we are the external evaluator, and it is our final perspective that's provided in the final reporting. But even from that perspective, we try very hard to generate recommendations that will meet their needs in terms of continuous improvement. For example, one of the Gateway project, like I said, they're very good at documentation of all of their meetings, and they have a project management system that is really phenomenal. So we've told them that they should be sharing that with the other TACT folks that they meet, and that kind of reaffirmation of what we've learned from the evaluation, I think really helped with building confidence. Next slide, please. So as I said, we really focus on telling the story. We use the multiple sources of data, the document analysis, interviewing, our field work. The four-stage path means that our reporting follows a very chronological style, which we think really helps show how the project is unfolding. And we try to include, as in a typical qualitative write-up, we try to include participant and staff voices, but we have to do so carefully to protect their privacy and their reputations. So we also, in our reporting, try to keep that internal and external context in mind. And as I'll show in a moment, that's because that really does affect our quantitative design as well. Next slide. Thank you. So you're still with me?
We can hear you just fine.
Okay, just checking. So in terms of integrating our qualitative implementation design and our quantitative approach, we're using propensity score matching, which from a theoretical point of view has a typical set of variables. And what our qualitative analysis helps us do is to examine those variables and tailor them a little bit more to context. One example of this is that we found that the presence of incumbent workers in the projects is a variable that's so prior employment and current employment is going to be a really important matching variable. Another one is in terms of educational history, has to do with the level of general education completed or not completed, things like that. It will also help us very much in deciding on our sampling strategies. And then also we're doing some other performance surveys for performance evaluation that are directly a result of our qualitative analysis. One example, I think, of the ways that the qualitative analysis has led to other research projects is the grantees have both done a good job of developing their participant data sets, but we realized that there were kind of gaps that we weren't sure of, and so we asked for transcript data, and we've been able to match the participants' student transcript data with and blend that in with the larger data set, and we think that that's resulted in a stronger set of data about the program participants and will help a lot in being able to interpret our impact results. And then finally, like I said, the issue of federal financial aid has been a really difficult challenge for the Online to Work program. And so it may be that the impact analysis as we designed it is just not going to be possible. But we will have a very strong story to be able to show exactly what did happen along the way. And we hope that that will provide some use to them, even if we can't do the impact analysis as we wanted to. Next slide, please. So I wanted to end our presentation with a set of questions that might be useful for the following conversation. It just reiterating some of the key things that we found were important about developing rapport, using multiple sources of data, helping our grantees develop confidence, and then also how we're using our qualitative findings to enhance the quantitative impact analysis. So hopefully we can have a good conversation about these things, and I'd be happy to answer any questions about our projects, of course. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. That was very informative, and I hope it prompts some good questions. I'm going to just, for the moment, take my moderator privilege and pose a question that I think will be interesting to a lot of people, for both you and Marcella. You both talked about providing formative feedback, in a sense, to your grantees. And I'm interested in if you could say something about the uptake. What was the response? And did you see any incorporation or acknowledgement or use of those findings, those interim findings about implementation?
Who would you like to go first?
Start with Marcella, just chronological order, I guess.
Okay.
Sure, Randy. I think, I think like Jane said, it really kind of depends. And for us, we are in a multi-site evaluation, so it can be a little bit harder to provide that formative feedback, but we do have a pretty open relationship with consortium management out of Bossier Parish Community College and are in constant communication with them. And I mean, I think, trying to sort of think of a specific example, but I just think this idea of having the lines of communication open have been really useful for us, and we certainly use some of the methods that Jane referred to of member checks. So whenever we've been writing up reports, we make sure to run them by the grantee so they can see themselves reflected by another set of eyes and make sure that we do everything accurately. And I mean, I think with this sort of data collection methods, I think it's probably the one way in which we've kind of been able to provide formative feedback, sort of saying, if you want to be able to do this impact study, these are the kinds of things that you should be collecting. And the colleges have been pretty open in figuring it out. I think that example that I mentioned between the non-credit and credit colleges and the colleges that implemented in the non-credit side of things, I'm actually now thinking of an example. They actually are trying to figure out if they can retroactively collect some of that data that they don't usually collect, so it can be used with the impact study. So, I mean, I guess that's one example. Sorry, that was a little bit long-winded.
Oh, that's great. Jane, do you have anything to share?
I think that I think that's exactly right. The member checking process of reflecting how we see them, and then also the ways that we ask questions. So I think one example is for both of our grantees who've been in the area of recruitment, where we see the data, their initial data, and this would be like in their initial implementation phase. And we noticed in both cases that they were recruiting a lot of not only incumbent workers in terms of the people who are already employed in some ways, but also incumbent students who are already at the institution. And so we would ask questions like, well, we see that, you know, you have, this is good, your numbers are, you're meeting your targets. However, are you concerned about what's going to happen when you've used up all of the incumbent students? And then they would, you know, so we just kind of put it out there, and then typically we'd see some reactions to that in the next set of meetings. Like that would be a topic for them to focus on in their staff meeting, and or they'd follow up and say, yes, we were worried about that too, and this is what we're doing. And sometimes it would be information that they hadn't given us before. We didn't know that they were doing these other things. So I think it's that kind of asking questions and reflecting what we're seeing and letting them respond to it is probably the best examples of how the feedback loop is working.
Thank you. Here's another question. This one's directed specifically to you, Jane, I believe, and it has to do with what tools or approaches you use to document communication patterns, and further, did you study communication dynamics or patterns at different intervals at multiple times during a study, during the
right.
research?
No, nothing that formal. I think I mentioned that the Gateway Community College, the grant is called IMPACT, which is an acronym that has advanced manufacturing in it somewhere. They are trained. Their project coordinator is trained in a project management format that has a very set approach to team meetings of different levels and so forth. And so for us, we know exactly where they are at any point because that they're in this process. The communication pattern for the other grantee was far more informal, so we are required then to take a more informal approach. And I would say that we've gathered more information from them, from attending their meetings, you know, going to lunch with them and so forth. But no, there isn't, we don't have a formal communication analysis design, if that's what the question was asking.
I think that's the spirit of the question. And here's another question, and I think it really applies to each of you, and it's about the process of communication between you and the grantee. With respect to open and thorough communication with the grantee, who drives that communication, the grantee or the evaluator? And in the case of Marcella's program for Gulf Coast, was the communication college by college, or did you hold large group meetings, and through what media, phone, video conference, email?
So I can go first real quick. So it's varied at different points in the evaluation. When we first started the evaluation, we of course had really open and constant communication with consortium management, and we also held a webinar for the consortium management and all of the 9 colleges to introduce ourselves, introduce our plan methodology, and do all of that kind of stuff. We've also held individual calls with all of the different colleges to kind of get to know them and explain what we're trying to do. And then, of course, we have the site visits that we've done where we've gotten to know the colleges, and kind of like Jane alluded to, we've, you know, participated in different meetings where all of the colleges have been there together and have gotten to meet people and see them there and interact with them and build relationships with people. So it's been a process, but we really do try to kind of be a part of communications. And the consortium itself actually holds a webinar for its members every month, for its members and for its technical assistance partners, and we make sure to participate in that as well. And that would be both us and the impact side of the evaluation team. So we just strive to be a present, collaborative partner with them and use different mediums to do that.
Yeah, for us, the basic structure that has guided our communication pattern is that we are included in all of the project meetings. We get the notifications when we're going to have a meeting. We typically try to have at least one member of the team listening in by phone or attending in person. Certainly not everyone, but as often as possible, and then we get the follow-up minutes. And that kind of serves as a trigger. So if something comes up in the meeting that we want to know more about, then I might send an email or a call. And sometimes it's big enough to say, you know, maybe we ought to have a meeting to talk about this issue so that we can understand it better. So we let the meetings, I would say we let the meeting structure serve as the trigger. The other trigger, in a bigger picture, is when Department of Labor asks for stuff and they don't know what they're supposed to do. So that usually triggers some rapid communication.
Okay. Here's a question which I believe is addressed to Marcella and the Gulf Coast IT analysis. And this is a request to elaborate more about your findings around federal financial aid and having a competency-based program. What were the specific problems? How were they resolved or remain unsolved?
Oh, I think that would be me.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I thought there was a competency-based piece in the other program too.
So there is, but I think it is to Jane.
Okay.
And I don't know if this is also affecting some of your program as well. It'd be interesting to hear because the online to work design is based on a larger curricular program called Learn on Demand. Students can sign up for a program of study. It's pretty much like within a week or 2 weeks, and then they have about 6 weeks to finish. And the program crosses over semesters. So if they were to start in November, they would actually finish in January or February. But if they are using federal financial aid, then that causes a problem because they can't take the financial, they have to complete the course within the semester of study, or it's considered to be an incomplete or worse. So the system had gotten, they'd gotten an exemption, or they thought they had, but then it didn't happen. And so they ended up actually closing down the project for a while. And they were still taking students, but not as they originally had intended to. So it's hard to say exactly what would be the cohort the treatment cohort, because it's a moving target, completely outside of the control of the project. So I don't know if that explains it a little bit.
For either of you, are you using implementation science rubrics for collecting data, things like quality implementation? Is that a construct, or are there similar constructs that you use in your framework?
Is the question referring to like compliance with certain kinds of training?
Or is it
I believe it's at a higher level in terms of quality of implementation.
So is it more like software to track implementation, or I'm trying to understand the question too.
Unfortunately, I can't shed more light on that. But here's a question from the same individual. Are you gathering data around how the grant is increasing the college's capacity? And there's a companion question I would tie to from another caller around how implementation is, how you've been evaluating the relationships with external stakeholders. So let's start with the question about capacity building.
When it comes to capacity building, Randy, this is Marcella. You spoke at the very beginning about how these grants really are about changing the capacity of colleges to deliver training to get people into jobs. And I mean, it's a pretty big lift, and I think it's one of the reasons why implementation studies are really important. And I mean, I think one of the ways in which we're doing this, and I think Jane mentioned it a little bit when she was talking about how they're documenting this chronologically to really be able to capture the evolution of a project, and in the same way, being able to sort of include the perspectives of different stakeholders, both in, when you're sort of attending all of these meetings, as well as when you're leading formal interviews and doing site visits. So we usually start, when we do site visits, doing interviews with sort of the key program stakeholders, but we make sure that we include folks like leadership teams, so like chancellors at colleges. We make sure that we include instructors. We talk to students. We talk to staff that provide support services. We also make sure to talk to external partners, so that kind of hits on the external partner question. So at the end of the day, we're kind of triangulating all of this information in that way, sort of trying to kind of start charting out patterns and themes and common themes, and figuring out how changes are happening at the institutions. And for us, a little bit, we have to kind of lift up some of these changes and report them out at a consortium level. Jane might have more other things to add about this.
Yeah, no, I think that captures it well. A lot of times talking to senior leadership is an interesting interview because they know about the project, but they're not involved in the day-to-day, but certain aspects of both projects will pop up as something that's crossed their radar because it's changed something about the way they saw their institution or the way they were operating. And at Gateway, for example, they've been successful in getting a number of grants, and so there's actually a fair amount of dialogue across grants, which has clearly influenced their capacity as a grant recipient and as an innovator in the community college field. And it's the synergy between grants would be kind of the finding on that. And that's one of the things that the senior leadership sees, so you can get that. I would make a comment about about the engagement with employers. We talked to one or two key employers really early on, and it was clear that although they'd been involved in terms of helping provide support for the grant application and knew about the application, the grant was still too young in terms of the implementation of the students, the participant activities, for them to have seen kind of any outcome, any product. So we've actually pushed back. We're putting together a survey now that's going to go out to all of the, again, starting with the employers that are on the short list that we know are involved in the project, and then expanding that in a purposeful way to try to capture a little bit more in the region. But we're doing that now as opposed to trying to do it earlier when, frankly, they just wouldn't have known much about the project.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would just like to quickly add that I agree with that point that Jane made about the employers. I think that's probably one of the more difficult stakeholders to get in touch with, and I've definitely had conversations with other TAC grantees about the issue that, this is a Department of Labor grant, and the influence on employers and that relationship is really important, but it's probably one of the harder ones to capture. So that's an interesting approach that Jane is using.
Right. Well, we're running down to the end of the hour. Just if either of you could reflect quickly on any concerns that the client had with you reaching out to employers, and any feedback you provided to the client from contacting the employers.
Well, just really quickly, I think it's really, again, about that line of open communication and building trust and sort of establishing yourself as a collaborator, as a partner. You're not really trying to, do harm here in a way, and sort of treading carefully, because for a lot of clients, employer relationships are they're sacred. It's something that they're also working on, and it's delicate. So kind of being able to sort of understand all of the nuances has been really important for us.
Yeah, we've actually been asked by our Gateway grantee. They want to know what the employers think of them, because they hear anecdotally positive and negative things, and they've actually run into a couple of a little bit of trouble where they thought that they were delivering a certain kind of training that was desired by the employers in production logistics, and then the employers who were supposed to be sending students into the program ended up not sending anyone. So they've actually, when we told them that we were going to do these kinds of activities to try to generate data about that relationship, they were very excited and we're seeing them be much more partners in the evaluation process of, yes, we need this data, how do we get it, what are the questions you're going to ask. So that's, again, I think delaying that until they got their installation stage behind them, it has helped a lot.
Okay. Well, I want to thank both of you, Marcela Montes of Aspen Institute and Jane Jensen of University of Kentucky College of Education, for joining us today and for providing very informative discussions. And to all of you out there that called in, I apologize if we didn't get to your questions. I hope you'll join us in future webinars. We will have another one in September, and stay tuned. We'll let you know date and time and topic we develop it. So thanks again, and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye.